if I told you that the greatest war in ancient history wasn't fought over land or religion or a woman? What if I told you it was a hostile takeover? We are taught that Rome was destiny, that the legions were unstoppable. But the truth is, before Rome became an empire, it was one bad quarter away from being erased from history, because it was standing in the shadow of a rival that didn't act like a kingdom. It acted like a multinational corporation, a superpower built on capital, not borders. A global network powered by contracts, not conscription. For a brief, terrifying moment, the future of the Western world didn't hang on a battle. It hung on a single economic question: what happens when an immovable object meets an unlimited budget? This isn't just the story of Rome versus Carthage. It is the story of the first time an army went to war against a bank, and the bank almost won. Welcome to Fiscal Flair. Long before Rome became the unchallenged master of the Mediterranean, it faced an enemy unlike anything it had ever encountered. A civilization that didn't conquer with legions, didn't expand through land hunger, and didn't dream of empire in the Roman sense at all. Carthage. A city built not for glory, not for ideology, but for commerce. Rome was a world of farmers, soldiers, and civic duty. A society that believed power came from the willingness of its citizens to bleed for the Republic. Carthage was a world of merchants, sailors, financiers, and traders. A society that believed power came from something far more modern: contracts, capital, and control of the seas. Where Rome raised armies from its own people, Carthage hired them. Where Rome fought to expand its borders, Carthage fought to expand its markets. Where Rome sought land, Carthage sought profit. It was a rivalry not just of nations, but of economic ideologies. Two models of civilization, two theories of power, hurtling toward collision. And when war finally erupted between them, it was no ordinary conflict. It was a pressure test, a test of which system could endure unimaginable strain without breaking. Rome had iron discipline, Carthage had limitless money. Rome could mobilize its entire society, Carthage could outsource its losses. Rome treated war as a civic duty, Carthage treated war as a business expense. For years, both sides believed their model would triumph. But neither understood that the war they entered would push their systems to the edge of self-destruction and reveal what each civilization truly stood upon when the cost of survival became unbearable. This is the story of how a mobilization republic faced a commercial superpower and why the outcome of that conflict reshaped the trajectory of Western history. A story of pressure, of endurance, of the limits of wealth, and the cost of resilience. And it begins in a world where every coastline was a battlefield, every ship was a weapon, and every decision on both sides carried the weight of civilizational destiny. Before the first spear was thrown, before the first trireme cut through the open sea, there existed a maritime world shaped not by soldiers, but by merchants, men who understood that the greatest power in the ancient Mediterranean did not lie in swords or legions, but in routes, harbors, and control of the currents that carried wealth. Arbor, and control of the currents that carried wealth. Carthage was not born as an empire. It grew into one, quietly, efficiently, deliberately, from a single principle: whoever controls the sea controls the future. From its strategic perch on the Tunisian coast, Carthage stretched invisible threads of influence across the Mediterranean. Not through conquest, but through trade agreements, resource monopolies, and a naval machine engineered not for glory, but for reliability, a floating infrastructure of profit. Its harbors were masterpieces of engineering. Massive circular docks where warships could be built, repaired, turned around, and launched faster than any rival could comprehend. A military marina disguised as a commercial one, or perhaps the other way around. Sailors, traders, mercenaries, and envoys poured through its ports like blood through the arteries of a living creature. They brought with them metals from Spain, timber from Sardinia, grain from Africa, slaves from everywhere, and silver, endless rivers of silver that fueled Carthage's vast economic reach. To outsiders, Carthage seemed almost weightless, a civilization without the heavy stone monuments of Egypt, without the philosophical prestige of Greece, without the rigid discipline of Rome. But those who understood commerce knew better. Carthage's power was hidden in the ledger. Its strength was written in contracts, not carved into stone walls. Where Rome counted how many farms it could muster for war, Carthage counted how many ships it could hire, how many mercenaries it could buy, how many rival markets it could close through sheer economic gravity. And beneath this commercial empire, there existed something else, something far more modern than ancient, a financial machine capable of turning gold into soldiers and soldiers into expansion without ever draining the lifeblood of its own people. While Rome sacrificed sons, Carthage signed contracts. While Rome buried its dead, Carthage hired replacements. While Rome mobilized its citizens, Carthage mobilized its wealth. It was strategy, the strategy of a civilization that believed money was more stable than manpower and commerce more reliable than patriotism, and for a long time, the world agreed. Carthage was the indispensable power of the Western Mediterranean, a node of influence from which goods, laws, ideas, and ambitions radiated outward. Its traders were respected, feared, imitated. Its ports were magnets for opportunity. Its navy was unmatched. Rome saw all of this. Rome watched, learned, and worried, because beneath the polite treaties, beneath the controlled diplomacy, beneath the facade of coexistence, Rome understood the truth. Carthage wasn't merely a rival, it was an alternative future, a different blueprint for how power could shape the world. A blueprint that threatened Rome's very identity. And that is why the collision between them was never a question of if, only a question of when. Rome was not born a naval power. Its strength came from land. From the soil worked by citizen farmers, from the discipline forged in the fields, from the unbroken chain of civic duty passed from father to son. Its armies were not mercenaries, they were Rome itself, mobilized in flesh and iron. But as Rome expanded southward, as its influence crept closer to the glittering Sicilian straits, it began to notice something unsettling on the horizon. The sea belonged to someone else. Every merchant ship that passed, every convoy that sailed for profit, every port that prospered along the western Mediterranean, all of them moved within Carthage's shadow. Rome saw wealth flowing across waters it did not control, saw rivals strengthened by trade routes it did not own, saw opportunities slipping into a world it did not understand. For a civilization grounded in land and legions, this was more than economic discomfort. It was a strategic nightmare. Because Rome could defeat any enemy it could reach, but Carthage lived where Rome could not yet follow. The sea was Carthage's fortress. Its ships were Carthage's walls. Its contracts were Carthage's influence diplomacy. Rome, for all its pride, was a spectator at the water's edge. And as Roman ambassadors traveled through Sicily, as Roman merchants struggled against Punic tariffs and trade policies, as Roman senators debated the future of their republic, a realization spread through Rome like a quiet, cold wind. As long as Carthage controlled the sea, Rome would always fight with half its strength tied down. Yet Rome was not a civilization that tolerated limits. Every barrier it encountered, political, geographic, economic, it eventually dismantled through patience, force, or reinvention. Still, this challenge was different. Rome could not simply build a navy overnight. It lacked the shipyards, the sailors, the maritime experience. Its warriors knew how to march, not how to navigate. Its commanders knew how to maneuver legions, not triremes. Carthage had mastery built over centuries. Rome had only ambition. But ambition in Rome was never idle. It was fuel, the kind that ignites when pressure becomes unbearable. And pressure was exactly what Carthage was creating. Every Punic trading post in Sicily, every tariff that disadvantaged Roman traders, every merchant alliance that excluded Roman interests, tightened the invisible noose. Rome began to see not just a competitor, but a threat to its future expansion, a threat to its security, a threat to its identity as a rising Mediterranean power. And beneath the surface, beneath the political language of diplomacy and treaties, a silent conviction formed in the hearts of Roman elites. Two systems, this different, could not share the same horizon forever. One would eventually dominate the Mediterranean. The other would be forced to submit to history. The only uncertainty was which system would fracture under the strain of conflict, and which would transform fast enough to survive it. Rome was about to discover whether a land empire could reinvent itself into something entirely new. And Carthage was about to discover whether money alone could withstand the relentless force of a mobilized republic. The island of Sicily was the hinge between worlds, a crossroads where the ambitions of two civilizations finally collided. To Carthage, Sicily was a vital extension of its commercial network, a protectorate woven with treaties, trading rights, and alliances built over generations. Its ports fed Punic wealth. Its farmland supported Punic fleets. Its political factions leaned toward Carthaginian influence as naturally as a coast leans toward the tide. To Rome, however, Sicily was something far more existential. It was proximity. It was opportunity. It was a gateway and, increasingly, a test of whether Rome's power would remain confined to the Italian peninsula or whether it would step on to the larger stage of the Mediterranean and declare itself a force that could not be contained by geography. The spark came, as great conflicts often do, from a small crisis that opened a vast valley of possibility. A city-state in Sicily, threatened by its rivals, sent desperate pleas for protection, first to Carthage, then to Rome. Both powers hesitated for only a moment. For each, the choice was clear. Ignoring Sicily meant surrendering the island to the other's influence. Intervening meant entering a rivalry neither side could walk away from. Carthaginian ships arrived first, sleek, experienced, confident, carrying soldiers and diplomats trained in the subtle art of Punic statecraft. They secured the city with practiced ease. But then Rome arrived, and Rome did not speak the language of subtlety. Roman consuls read the situation not as diplomacy, but as a strategic insult. A reminder that Carthage could act faster, reach farther, and insert itself into the affairs of lands Rome considered its natural sphere of influence. For Rome, this was unacceptable. For Carthage, Rome's presence was provocative. The stage was now set for a confrontation neither civilization had fully intended, but both now felt compelled to pursue. The diplomats spoke of treaties. The generals measured risks. The senators and the council weighed the cost of escalation. But beneath all this formal deliberation ran the true engine of conflict, fear. Rome feared being surrounded by a maritime empire that could strangle its ambitions. Carthage feared the emergence of a land power too disciplined, too hungry, and too willing to reshape the world in its own image. Both feared losing the future. And so, with every failed negotiation, with every small escalation, with every refusal to back down, the two civilizations drew closer to a war neither could afford and neither could avoid. It was not merely a clash of armies but a collision of worldviews. A republic that believed in mobilization against a corporation-like empire that believed in monetization. A society of citizen soldiers against a society of professional mercenaries. A model built on sacrifice against a model built on profit. Sicily was the first battleground, but what was truly at stake was the question of which system could endure the brutal arithmetic of war. For Rome and Carthage, the horizon was narrowing, and the first notes of a conflict that would reshape Mediterranean history were beginning to echo over the island. When war finally ignited between Rome and Carthage, it did not begin as a contest of strength, but as a revelation of what each civilization truly relied on, what it valued, and what it was willing to sacrifice for survival. Carthage entered the conflict with confidence. Why wouldn't it? For centuries, its navy had been the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Its trading network spanned coasts and continents. Its treasury overflowed with wealth drawn from silver mines, tariffs, and tribute. War, for Carthage, was not a national trauma. It was a business expense. Hire mercenaries, deploy ships, manage logistics, win quickly, return to profit. The Punic leadership believed that money could solve every problem because, in their world, it always had. Rome entered the war with something entirely different, something both fragile and frightening, the mobilized will of its citizens. Roman soldiers did not fight for wages. They fought for identity, for honor, for the republic that defined their place in the world. Every Roman who marched into battle also marched into history. To fight was to belong. But Rome had a weakness. Carthage did not. It had no navy. In a war over Sicily, an island surrounded by water, Rome had brought a sword to a battle of ships. Carthage expected the conflict to end there. But the stress test had only just begun. For the first time in its history, Rome confronted a strategic limitation too large to ignore. And in that moment of crisis, the Republic made a decision that stunned the ancient world. Rome would not accept the natural order. It would rewrite it. It would become a naval power, not gradually, not over generations, not with the patience of a culture steeped in maritime tradition, but immediately, with urgency so intense it bordered on desperation. Roman engineers studied Carthaginian shipwrecks as if deciphering a foreign technology. Shipyards erupted overnight. Forests were cut down by the thousands. Citizens who had never set foot on a deck were now training to man triremes. Where Carthage relied on experience, Rome relied on discipline. Where Carthage trusted its sailors, Rome trusted its system. Where Carthage assumed naval supremacy, Rome refused to believe in such a thing. War, more than anything, became a magnifying glass. It exposed Carthage's dependence on financial capital and Rome's dependence on social capital. It revealed a truth that echoes through history. Wealth can buy power, but it cannot buy resilience. Rome could lose thousands of men and still mobilize thousands more. Its people were the engine of its endurance. Carthage could lose thousands of mercenaries and replace them, but every replacement cost silver, and silver too can run thin. Each civilization had entered the war believing it understood its enemy. Both were wrong. What neither side realized was that the conflict ahead would push their systems beyond anything they were designed to withstand, and the one that survived would not be the one with the most wealth, but the one with the deepest capacity to endure pressure. As the war dragged on, a truth began to surface. Slowly at first, like stress fractures spreading through stone, and then unmistakably, Carthage's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. Its armies were vast, diverse, and undeniably skilled. Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, Balearic slingers, a mosaic of elite fighters drawn from every corner of the Mediterranean. But they had one thing in common. They fought for Carthage because Carthage paid them. Loyalty was transactional. Discipline was contractual. Their courage could be extraordinary, but it was courage rented by the campaign. For Carthage, this system had always worked. Why force citizens to die in battle when you can purchase the very best warriors in the world? And Igor, why sacrifice your sons when you can outsource the suffering? But war against Rome exposed the dark side of that logic. A mercenary army does not feel humiliation when defeated. A mercenary army does not burn with righteous fury when comrades fall. A mercenary army does not rebuild itself from generational pride. It fights hard, but it does not bleed meaning. Rome, by contrast, was held together by something Carthage had never needed, a culture of obligation. When a Roman legion broke, Rome mourned, then reformed the line, rearmed the men, rebuilt the units, and returned them to the front with a ferocity born not from payment, but from identity. Defeat stung Rome. Defeat inconvenienced Carthage. And wars, especially long wars, are determined by who can suffer more. The longer the conflict stretched on, the more Carthage's economic logic began to crack under pressure. Mercenaries demanded higher wages. Some refused to fight in storms. Some mutinied when payments came late. Some even changed sides when Rome offered better terms. This was not a moral failing. It was the natural behavior of a force fighting for reward rather than belonging. But it created a pattern Rome understood all too well. Carthage could win battles, but Rome could win wars. Because wars are not contests of skill. They are contests of endurance. Rome had a population trained for collective sacrifice. Carthage had a treasury trained for strategic expenditure. Treasuries empty, peoples endure. The Senate recognized this truth early. The Carthaginian council recognized it too late. Each new campaign required more silver, more recruitment, more negotiation with foreign tribes. Each Roman defeat summoned more legions from a society conditioned to see warfare as a civic calling. And as costs rose, Carthage's hired armies became not just an expense, but a liability. For the first time in its proud mercantile history, Carthage found itself in an unfamiliar position, paying to maintain a war that Rome was willing to die to win. And beneath the calculations of the council, beneath the logistics of fleets and payments and provisioning, a quiet, unsettling realization grew. Money could wage war, but it could not inspire it. Rome had tapped into something deeper, a national will that no amount of silver could replicate. And that difference was beginning to tilt the balance of destiny. As the war dragged on, a truth began to surface. Slowly at first, like stress fractures spreading through stone, and then unmistakably, Carthage's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. Its armies were vast, diverse, and undeniably skilled. Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, Balearic slingers, a mosaic of elite fighters drawn from every corner of the Mediterranean. But they had one thing in common. They fought for Carthage because Carthage paid them. Loyalty was transactional. Discipline was contractual. Their courage could be extraordinary, but it was courage rented by the campaign. For Carthage, this system had always worked. Why force citizens to die in battle when you can purchase the very best warriors in the world? Why sacrifice your sons when you can outsource the suffering? But war against Rome exposed the dark side of that logic. A mercenary army does not feel humiliation when defeated. A mercenary army does not burn with righteous fury when comrades fall. A mercenary army does not rebuild itself from generational pride. It fights hard, but it does not bleed meaning. Rome, by contrast, was held together by something Carthage had never needed, a culture of obligation. When a Roman legion broke, Rome mourned, then reformed the line, rearmed the men, rebuilt the units, and returned them to the front with a ferocity born not from payment, but from identity. Defeat stung Rome. Defeat inconvenienced Carthage. And wars, especially long wars, are determined by who can suffer more. The longer the conflict stretched on, the more Carthage's economic logic began to crack under pressure. Mercenaries demanded higher wages. Some refused to fight in storms. Some mutinied when payments came late. Some even changed sides when Rome offered better terms. This was not a moral failing. It was the natural behavior of a force fighting for reward rather than belonging. But it created a pattern Rome understood all too well. Carthage could win battles, but Rome could win wars. Because wars are not contests of skill. They are contests of endurance. Rome had a population trained for collective sacrifice. Carthage had a treasury trained for strategic expenditure. Treasuries empty, peoples endure. The Senate recognized this truth early. The Carthaginian council recognized it too late. Each new campaign required more silver, more recruitment, more negotiation with foreign tribes. Each Roman defeat summoned more legions from a society conditioned to see warfare as a civic calling. And as costs rose, Carthage's hired armies became not just an expense, but a liability. For the first time in its proud mercantile history, Carthage found itself in an unfamiliar position, paying to maintain a war that Rome was willing to die to win. And beneath the calculations of the council, beneath the logistics of fleets and payments and provisioning, a quiet, unsettling realization grew. Money could wage war, but it could not inspire it. Rome had tapped into something deeper, a national will that no amount of silver could replicate. And that difference was beginning to tilt the balance of destiny. Even before the end of the First Punic War, a quiet truth was beginning to settle over Carthage, a truth more dangerous than any Roman legion or naval defeat. The war was draining Carthage in a way it was never designed to endure. For centuries, Carthage had existed in a world where war was an occasional, contained expense, a limited disruption to the real engine of its power, trade. But prolonged, grinding conflict created a type of pressure that exposed the vulnerabilities of a commercial empire. The first cracks appeared in the treasury. Each new campaign required fresh mercenaries. Each fresh mercenary required silver. Silver required stable trade routes that Rome was now disrupting, harassing, and contesting with its expanding naval presence. Carthage could still buy armies, but the cost of buying them was rising faster than its ability to replace the silver being poured into the war. The council tried to adapt. They raised taxes, they squeezed colonies, they demanded increased production from subject peoples. They leaned harder on African farmlands as wine, olive oil, grain, and livestock were diverted toward military logistics. But this only exposed the deeper problem. Carthage had never built a patriotic reservoir. Its people prospered in peace. They did not mobilize in war. They did not volunteer for hardship. They did not redefine themselves under pressure as Rome did. Where Romans saw endurance as a civic virtue, Carthaginians saw prolonged suffering as a sign of strategic failure. The war lasted too long for a mercantile machine and too deeply for a council of merchants. And the cracks widened. The Senate in Rome grew more determined after every loss. The council in Carthage grew more anxious after every expense. No treasury can support a war indefinitely when the war stretches beyond the logic of profit, and this one was beginning to do just that. At first, Carthage reassured itself, we have the ships, we have the experience, we have the wealth. But wealth is not an infinite shield. Experience does not guarantee victory. Ships rot, burn, sink. Rome was adapting. Rome was persevering. Rome was learning the sea. Carthage was paying for it. The Mediterranean had shifted. What had once been a Punic lake was now a contested frontier. And Carthage felt something it had not felt for generations. Strain on its finances, strain on its foreign alliances, strain on its governing council, strain on its citizens who were unused to war reaching so deeply into their daily lives. Rome had discovered Carthage's limit. Not military, not naval, not strategic, but psychological. Because a commercial empire can fight brilliantly until the cost of fighting exceeds the value of winning, and Rome's relentless pressure was pushing Carthage toward that threshold. The war was no longer about Sicily. It was no longer about honor, territory, or negotiation. It was becoming a test of which civilization would reach its breaking point first. And for the first time, Carthage feared the answer. For most of the war, Rome had fought on Carthage's terms, chasing a maritime empire across waters it barely understood, adapting to naval combat as if learning a foreign language through painful immersion. But then, somewhere between disaster and determination, Rome discovered an insight so simple and yet so devastating that it would alter the fate of the Mediterranean. If Rome could turn sea battles into land battles, Rome could win. And so the Romans invented a weapon as blunt, as practical, and as psychologically revealing as the civilization that forged it. They called it the Corvus, the Raven. It was nothing more than a massive boarding bridge, a heavy timber plank with a metal spike that crashed onto an enemy deck and locked the two ships together. But this simple innovation transformed the nature of naval warfare. Carthaginian skill no longer mattered. Their centuries of seamanship, their maneuvering precision, their tactical mastery, all of it evaporated the moment a Roman ship closed the distance. The sea ceased to be Carthage's realm. It became an extension of Roman infantry. Where Carthage danced across the waves, Rome simply grabbed the enemy and dragged them into a fight it knew how to win. The Corvus was not elegant, it was not graceful, it was not the product of naval tradition or maritime genius. It was the product of a mentality. Rome does not adapt to the battlefield. Rome forces the battlefield to adapt to Rome. This psychological shift was far more important than the device itself. Rome had stopped learning from Carthage and begun overpowering it. It no longer respected the Punic advantage. It no longer saw naval warfare as a realm where Carthage held superiority. Rome had found a way to make Carthage's greatest strength irrelevant. The consequences were immediate. Where Roman fleets had once been humiliated, they now began winning with shocking speed. Carthaginian admirals, long accustomed to domination at sea, now faced boarding assaults that transformed graceful naval duels into brutal infantry brawls. The psychological shock was immense. Carthage's sailors were trained for maneuver. Rome's soldiers were trained for massacre. The Punic navy, the pride of a commercial empire, the shield of its prosperity, the vessel of its expansion, had met an enemy that refused to play by its rules. And the council could feel the shift. Victories no longer felt secure. Losses no longer felt recoverable. Rome was no longer a land power merely dabbling in naval warfare. It was becoming a maritime force with land war instincts. Carthage still had resources, still had allies, still had mercenaries, still had shipyards. But Rome now possessed something Carthage could not purchase, imitate, or outmaneuver: momentum. And when a civilization built on endurance begins gaining momentum, the world around it starts to change. As the war stretched into its final, punishing years, Carthage found itself confronting a crisis it had never imagined. A crisis not of strategy or weaponry, but of identity. For generations, the Punic elite believed that money could solve any problem. That silver could buy time, buy armies, buy solutions. That commerce was a shield, a guarantee against the chaos that consumed lesser nations. But now, that confidence was trembling. Rome had survived storms, shipwrecks, catastrophic defeats, and unimaginable losses. Yet its will had not thinned. Its manpower had not dried. Its identity had not fractured. Each Roman failure seemed only to intensify the Republic's sense of purpose. Carthage, meanwhile, felt each setback as a weight upon the treasury, a strain on diplomacy, a disruption of trade, a question mark over the logic that had sustained its empire. And then came the moment that exposed just how deeply the war had hollowed Carthage: the mercenary revolt. It began as a dispute over unpaid wages. A misunderstanding, the council believed, a temporary inconvenience. But mercenaries do not tolerate delay. They do not fight for gratitude. They do not suffer quietly. Tens of thousands of men, veterans hardened by the war in Sicily, turned on the very city that had hired them. What followed was not a rebellion. It was a nightmare. Entire regions of North Africa rose in violence, drawn by the promise of plunder and the scent of Punic weakness. Carthaginian commanders, long accustomed to commanding foreign armies, found themselves fighting a war on their own soil, a war they had to pay for against soldiers they had already paid, and the council understood, with icy clarity, that this revolt was not merely a rebellion, it was a consequence. A consequence of relying on money to solve every strategic challenge. A consequence of waging a war without the social fabric required to sustain it. A consequence of building an empire on contracts instead of citizenship. Rome watched from across the sea, astonished. The war that had nearly broken the Republic was now breaking the empire that had forced Rome into the conflict. For Carthage, this was the breaking point, not because it lacked warriors, not because it lacked wealth, but because it lacked what Rome possessed: an overwhelming supply, a unified people who believed the state was worth suffering for. The rebellion was eventually crushed, with brutality and desperation, but the damage had already spread like cracks in marble. Carthage had been wounded in the one place no treasury could mend: its confidence. And in the shadows of its recovery, as silver was counted and alliances repaired, a realization settled over Carthage like an unwelcome fog. Rome could afford what Carthage could not endure. The war was no longer about Sicily or naval supremacy or regional influence. It had become something far more dangerous, a measurement of which civilization had the inner architecture to survive catastrophe, and Carthage feared that Rome had discovered the answer. By the final years of the war, the Mediterranean no longer belonged to Carthage, not because Rome had seized every harbor or mastered every current, but because Rome had mastered something far more decisive: the art of suffering with purpose. Carthage still had ships. Carthage still had silver. Carthage still had veteran commanders who understood the sea better than any Roman alive. But Rome had acquired something Carthage could never buy: a culture transformed by war, honed by tragedy, and forged into a weapon. The republic that had entered the conflict as a landlocked power was gone. In its place stood a new Rome, a hybrid civilization, equally deadly on sea and land, led by consuls who had grown up under the constant pressure of Punic resistance. Then came the moment when endurance finally overtook experience. In a desperate gamble, Rome built one last fleet, not elegant, not polished, but massive. Ships constructed from borrowed timber and funded by private citizens who had mortgaged their estates because the Senate asked them to. This was not commerce. This was not calculation. This was a society putting its heart on the water. Carthage sent its navy to meet them, The old confidence, the maritime heritage, the storied history, the unmatched seamanship, all of it sailed into the open sea ready to deliver a final blow. But something was different. Rome's fleet did not wither in panic. It did not falter under Carthaginian maneuvering. It did not crumble as it had in earlier years. It advanced. It closed the distance. It deployed the brutal efficiency of its infantry-based naval doctrine. In Carthage, exhausted, strained, uncertain of its own political backing, and haunted by the recent mercenary revolt, could not resist with the unshakable resolve it once possessed. The final battle was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a symbolic collapse. A moment when Carthage realized that Rome's will had outlasted Carthage's wealth. The sea, long a Punic inheritance, shifted its allegiance. Rome emerged from the battle not just victorious, but transformed. Carthage emerged not just defeated, but exposed. The war had tested each civilization at the deepest possible level. Rome had been pushed beyond every reasonable limit and survived. Carthage had been pushed beyond every reasonable limit and fractured. And now, with its treasury depleted, its alliances strained, its citizens weary, and its confidence broken, Carthage could no longer sustain the strategic posture it once held. The tide had turned. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but inevitably. The slow, crushing inevitability of a system built for commerce colliding with a system built for endurance. Rome's legions did not win the sea. Rome's character did. And Carthage, for all its brilliance, was forced to confront a truth that reshaped the ancient world. Economic power can dominate an age, but only political will can survive one. In the end, the First Punic War did not simply decide who controlled Sicily, or who commanded the Western Mediterranean, or which flag would rise above shattered fleets and exhausted armies. It decided something far deeper, which civilization understood what power truly requires. Carthage entered the war with every advantage a commercial empire could possess. Wealth, experience, naval supremacy, and a network of influence that stretched across coasts and continents. And yet it was undone not by lack of talent, nor by lack of resources, nor by lack of brilliant commanders, but by a lack of something more fundamental, a society capable of enduring sustained sacrifice. Rome entered the war unprepared, unskilled at sea, without the maritime heritage necessary to challenge an oceanic empire. And yet, it prevailed not because of superior strategy, nor because of miraculous luck, nor because of overwhelming resources, but because it possessed a reservoir Carthage had never cultivated, a population that believed the Republic was worth suffering for. The war revealed a truth that echoes across the centuries. Wealth can build fleets, but it cannot build resilience. Money can hire armies, but it cannot forge unity. Commerce can shape prosperity, but only character can survive catastrophe. Carthage fought with logic. Rome fought with identity. And history remembers the victor not as the civilization with deeper coffers, but as the one with deeper conviction. The fall of Carthage's supremacy was not the failure of its economy. It was the failure of a system that could not convert prosperity into purpose. The rise of Rome was not the triumph of strategy alone. It was the triumph of a civilization that discovered that pressure does not destroy a nation. It reveals it. And what it revealed in Rome was a society willing to reinvent itself, rebuild itself, and endure beyond the limits that should have broken it. Carthage taught the ancient world how to trade. Rome taught it how to survive. And when the dust settled over the waters of the Mediterranean, one truth remained. Empires rise through ambition. They endure through sacrifice. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.